Hello everyone. I'm so glad you could all get together today to honor and remember your good friend, your loved relative, your colleague, or acquaintance, Jim O'Connell. Unfortunately, as Joan may have explained, I wasn't able to be there in person, but through the magic of videography and the great support from my showrunner, my wife, Susan Johnson, we're coming to you live in person. Joan was so gracious to agree to let me record my remembrances of the time I had with Jim over almost 70 years. Like all of you, I am still processing the loss of Jim. So if there are gaps in the recording or some discontinuities, it's either because I was losing it or because I was rolling on the ground in hysterical laughter. We shall see. I know Jim would want us to keep this light, and I will continue in that format. Jim never wanted to impose on anyone, but I'm glad we could all get together today. First, for those who don't know me, my name is Russ Tamouche, and I've been a close friend with Jim since we were 13 years old. I will group my stories into 4 categories, which I think define the essence of who Jim was. So let's put them in 3 F's and 1 G. No, those weren't our grades in high school. There were some D's too. Grading was really tough back then. Actually, as you know, Jim was a great learner and very bright. He could also be challenging to his teachers, but in a respectful way. So it was Cambridge High and Latin School, the 3rd oldest school in the country, and it showed it. We kept saying, it's time for a new building. And we all had to take 2 years of Latin. Some 30 years ago, instead of a new building, it was combined with Ringe Tech, and is now called Cambridge Ringe and Latin School, the only place in the world where the basketball team speaks Latin. You know, we ate lunch every day in the cafeteria, and Jim would welcome others to our table, especially minorities or those that didn't seem to have any companions. One in particular comes to mind now, Clyde Lindsay. He was a large African American with an easy smile showing large gaps in his teeth. And he talked very plainly and slowly, but intelligently. I was astonished some years later when I was in my dorm room at Harvard College and Jim knocked on the door and had Clyde with him. I was a senior and Clyde had been in the service a few years, I think, but he was now part of the entering freshman class. He went on to go to Harvard Law School and become an immigration attorney. Jim maintained his friendship with him for many years. Another friend, Mike, owned a Thunderbird, which Jimmy loved. A classmate got a ride to school every day from a parent with a Jaguar XKE, my all-time favorite car. Well, dreams come and go, and Jimmy never got his T-Bird, and I never got my Jaguar. Jim always, and I mean 100%, brought a sandwich of cheese and a hard roll for lunch. I at least had other meals like peanut butter and jelly, and sometimes both at the same time. So I always kidded him. Actually, decades later, I tried his menu, and I loved now putting cheese in a hard roll. I make it quite frequently. So thank you, Jim. Jim and I lived at opposite ends of Cambridge, but we met at Sea Explorers and soon became best friends, along with Bill O'Neill, who may be present today. So now for the words that I'd like to use defining Jim, the 3 F's: family, friendship, and fun. Starting with family, of course, you know, Jim adored his family and never wanted to be far from them. The special place, of course, was Sandy Island on Lake Winnipesaukee in New Hampshire. We never stayed with them because it was a bit too rustic for my. But I had a motor cruiser at a marina on the lake. I'd had it for several years. So one time, Susan and I took a trip over to Sandy to take a look and then take Jim and Joan out on a small cruise. As we were coming back, we found that we could not find Sandy. All the islands at sea level looked the same, and there were no distinguishing features on Sandy. I have to admit I'm no Magellan, even with advanced navigational equipment. We eventually did find it and nosed our way in through the shifting sandbars. But nobody got hurt, as they say. And I have to thank Jim and Joan for not laughing or screaming. All right, let's get on to fun and friendship. A few months ago, I had told Jim's daughter, that I really valued Jim's sense of humor. And I think you all know what I'm talking about. He was one of the funniest guys that I ever met. So Jen said that she'd love to hear some of his jokes sometime. But Jen, I don't have any. Maybe there weren't any jokes in the 50s. Or maybe it says something about me. If someone told me a joke this morning, I would not remember it by dinner time. But I do have many funny stories. Some of them mischievous or actually borderline illegal, some not politically correct today, but all of them hilarious. So let's talk about vehicles. Jim had a motorcycle for many years, and he had a number of various automobiles. He visited me once in a it wasn't new, it was an old, small, sporty convertible. We were probably late teens. I got a call that evening, a few hours after he left, and he was laughing a little bit. It appears that as he was getting close to home, he had an abrupt meeting with a fire hydrant. And yes, the hydrant was toppled. And yes, the pipe had burst. And yes, the top of the convertible was down. And yes, water was flowing down on the vehicle and on Jim. Well, the police came and took Jim not to the hospital, but to the police station. But his father got him out the next day. Then I remember once calling him as I was planning to buy a new car, and I asked him what he was driving. Well, as I recall, it was something like, well, half a Studebaker, half a Toyota, and a little Chevrolet thrown in. Jim loved to tinker, and he could fix practically everything, or at least have a good time trying. Now to Sea Explorers. I joined and met Jim when we were about 13. Bill O'Neill became a member about the same time, and we gradually bonded and became lifelong friends. Bill and Jim actually were born on the same day, June 6, 1944, which was D-Day, or the Normandy invasion. And I remember three of us used to go to the dog track on June 6th and bet the Daily Double 6-6. And of course we never won anything, but we had a good time among the people scattered in the stands. Anyway, the scouts were given this old 38-foot wooden Coast Guard boat from World War II that was sunk, then salvaged off Italy. It had bunks for a crew of 2. Well, somehow we managed to stuff 15 or sometimes 18 kids in it and head off for a 2-week cruise. We could go all over Cape Cod, all over New England, and have a great time. We'd have guys sleeping on hammocks above the engine. We'd have 5 guys in the cabin built for 2, mostly on the floor. People were sleeping in the wheelhouse and outside anywhere that was flat. You know, we were given these old Navy uniforms with the middle stripe removed. For any older vets out there, you have my full sympathy. The blues were 100% wool, we were told, but actually they weren't anything like cashmere, they were more like burlap. and on a hot summer day, everybody was itching and scratching. We did have dress whites, but they were very heavy linen. And we had those white sailor caps that I associate with oranges and juice. And of course, the black pea coats, or navy, I guess, for the winter. Unfortunately, all my brownie pictures of that era are gone, but I did find a few. You know, we think those old, itchy, scratchy uniforms would be a benefit when we were trying to attract some female attention. Then we were proud as peacocks. I have to remind you, I'm not making any of this up, but let me tell you about the time we got kicked off Martha's Vineyard. Probably the only ones other than Alan Dershowitz, the controversial Harvard lawyer. Here's how it happened, and I'm sure you remember, Bill. So we docked in Oak Bluffs, right across from the old Wesley Hotel. The owner there didn't think we were good for his business, so he could be nasty, and he watched us very closely. One afternoon, I was on watch while Jim and the others went into town. They came back with a municipal street sign, like New York Avenue. And they decided they needed to hide it somewhere on the boat, and they thought that in the bilge underneath the engine room would be a good place. Then they were gone for more mischief. I was getting a good tan when a police cruiser pulled up with the harbor master. They got out and asked me if I was enjoying myself. I said, yeah, we've had great fun. And they said, okay, kid, where's the sign? And I said, what sign? So they got on board, without a warrant, I'm sure, and searched the boat. They did go into the engine room, and I can't remember if they did find the sign or not, but it didn't matter because the owner of the hotel had seen, I guess, us putting the sign away. Well, we were told to cast off and not come back. So that evening we headed over to Edgartown. I guess our reputation did not precede us. We were allowed in. We spent the night there and then took off for Provincetown or Nantucket or somewhere else where we're more welcome. Of course, we played practical jokes on each other and jabbed each other. There was a Dave, and he wasn't the brightest guy on the ship. One day we were all bored, and I just, for some reason, in horror, pointed to Dave, and I said, Dave, you got lobes on your ear. And he had no idea what I was talking about. He was taken aback. Became very concerned, and Jim loved that, and it became a meme. So Jim, for the next year, would tell Dave he's got lobes on his ears. And I'm not sure even today that Dave understands that everybody has earlobes. And of course there were nicknames, ethnic or otherwise. We had a field day with my last name. But you can't do much with O'Connell or O'Neill. Sometimes for a year or two we called Jim Okie. Now let's talk about that trip Jim, Bill, and I took to Martha's Vineyard, I think in our late teens. Yes, they did let us back in. Or they had forgotten that we were banished several years ago. Now, I'm sure if it was anyone other than Jim, he would say, I'm making this up. But this is all true. My dad had given me his old '88 Oldsmobile. It was a large sedan. It was pink for some reason. It was officially called Dusty Rose. None of us had much money, but we had decided to go to Martha's Vineyard for a long weekend. It was to be a low-budget affair. Getting on the ferry at Woods Hole, we bought a ticket for the car and 3 one-way passenger tickets. We had a great time for a few days there, and then it was time to go home. We were looking at our finances and decided that It was close, but we should be okay. Let's go and have another beer anyway. But when we got to the ferry office, we came up short. We were a few dollars short. So Jim came up with this idea of buying a ticket for the car and 2 passenger tickets. And he would get in the trunk and we would close it but leave it open a crack so we could have some air. Well, when Bill and I got up to the second deck, we looked down and we saw a crew member noticing a partially open trunk, and he slammed it shut. And he stayed around guarding the cargo for the rest of the trip. Well, Bill and I looked at each other with wide eyes, not knowing what to do. And I'm ashamed to say we didn't do anything. So when we docked, we quickly pulled over on a side street and went over to open the trunk, not knowing whether we'd find a body there or what would be there. So we opened the trunk, and what we saw was Jim sitting in a lotus position with a big smile on his face. Now, you all know that Jim liked music, not mainstream music, but his favorites were Woody Guthrie and Pete Seeger. And eventually, Jim got a banjo, and I got a banjo. I had a very old banjo that couldn't be tuned. Jim learned how to play a little bit, and I never did. Back then, my family owned a 3-decker. And we rented out the other 2 floors. We lived in the middle. And we had some very distinguished renters like Dr. Noam Chomsky, a very famous linguist and activist. We also had the Jim Kweskin Jug Band. Actually, 2 of the members, Jeff and Maria Muldar, lived upstairs for a few years. They had promised not to jam up there because they had a studio where they practiced, but they would have small sessions of a few people on occasion. Well, my mother let it be known that I played the banjo. And I said, well, they invited me to jam with them. I said, no, I have a friend who's a little bit better, maybe he would do it. But Jim declined, and but he said, if Maria ever goes out sunbathing in her bikini again, let him know, he'll be right over. For those of you who don't know what a jug band is, let me tell you what the instruments are. Typically, they are a kazoo, a banjo, a washboard, a guitar, a violin, and a kitchen pot. Maria was gorgeous, at least to 2 adolescent boys. Maria and Jeff left each other at some point, and they left the band and eventually became very successful in their own right. I'm playing now a little Jim Kweskin jug band music from his album. I forgot that there was also a harmonica involved as a major instrument. Now for the G word, generosity. Jim, along with his wonderful wife, were the most generous people I had ever met, not only with friends, but with complete strangers. He didn't want to spend money on himself. He'd rather give it to other people so they can get what they wanted or needed. Whether he knew them or not, he was very generous. Literally, he would give you the shirt off his back. For example, 13 years ago, we had a wedding for our daughter on Martha's Vineyard. Jim and Joan came along. My niece Erica was there, and she's kind of a kooky artist. She saw Jim with his kooky tie and asked him where he had bought it so she could buy one for her boyfriend. Well, Jim immediately took his tie off on the spot and gave it to her. That's the kind of person he was. Another example of Jim's compassion and generosity is a story he told me many years ago, and I vaguely remember. He had met a man from Texas online, and they became chat buddies. When Jim later learned that he had a terminal disease and no close friends or relatives, Jim flew down there and spent a few weeks with him before his demise. Now, another thing that Jim loved was kids, and he always chatted with them on the street or played with them. I remember whenever we would drive around and would see a school bus with kids at the window waving frantically, nobody ever responded except Jim. Jim would wave to them and get them excited. I did not do it because it was not cool. Well, years later, I remembered and I started doing it, and it was really cool to wave to the kids. I even wave to people when I'm on a ship or a ferry or a boat somewhere. That's cool. I would like to close and leave you with a thought. Often I install this whimsical work of art on my TV, and it's called Even a Rainy Day is a Good Day. So it shows a young couple sitting on a roof of their home with 2 steaming cups of coffee or hot cocoa, and they have an umbrella because it is raining outside. But I just want to close by saying, Jim, wherever you are, I hope it's not raining, but I'm sure it's a good day.